So we see that this war in Iran has many aspects that I believe Russia will interpret in its own way. These include deceptive diplomacy, lawlessness, the brutality of war, the willingness to provoke, the assassination of government officials, attacks on critical infrastructure, nuclear power plants. Perhaps the US goal is to weaken Russia and China, but as we see, they miscalculated and Iran has proven resilient. It could also lead to the destruction of the Persian Gulf countries if their desalination plants are damaged. We see that relations between the Americans and Europeans have deteriorated. So again, all of this suggests that the consequences of this war will be not only regional, but also global, but also. How do you think this catastrophe in the Middle East will affect the East, and again, primarily Russia and China, and how will it be perceived in these countries? First, I'd like to digress a little from this topic. When we talk about Russia, we talk about President Putin and his administration. His administration is what they say and what the so-called talking heads say. I mean, the Moscow elite says what's a broadcast on talk shows and elsewhere. These are very different things. If you look at President Putin and his closest aides, or more precise, the foreign minister, you can see that the Kremlin is practically not reacting at all to these dramatic, shocking events that affect all possible relations with Donald Trump and the world order as a whole. The reaction is surprisingly weak. Trump's behavior is disgusting. It's outrageous. I don't want to pick other derogatory words. I think he's already secured a place in hell for himself. But that's my personal opinion. I'm not speaking as an analyst. From an analyst perspective, what he did is completely outrageous. It completely destroys anything that even remotely resembles a world order. Respect for the UN Charter, respect for international law. He has declared that he is constrained only by his own moral world principles, his own understanding. Morality, and not by international or any other law. And he acts in accordance with them. The problem is that his morality is bestial. His behavior, by ordinary human standards, is the most disgusting we have seen in a very, very long time. And let me distinguish between words and deeds. American presidents and their aides have done terrible things in our nation. Remember Nixon and Kissinger. But they have never said it so openly to your face. Saving question. They can do anything, and you will have to accept what we do. It is absolutely outrageous. This distinction, of course, comes up on all the talk shows. It is much talked about that we have never encountered such directness and openness regarding policy. Might is right. But when it comes to trust in Trump, there is almost complete silence. Force, they don't dare say anything about Mr. Trump showing his true colors. They don't say they intend to continue negotiations. They don't say they intend to stop them. They simply note that they are in limbo, and the Americans ask for this. As for Iran, many of us in the alternative media assume that Iran must behave in accordance with practice. Within the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, And BRICS, these two major powers, provided it with stability, a certain sense of security, and completely legitimate reasons to behave with restraint and not sponsor. Now we see that these two associations are practically meaningless. As far as we know, neither Russia nor China provide significant support to Iran. I am very careful in my statements on this matter, because it is difficult to say how reliable our information is, since all this is kept secret. But given the lack of accusations against Russia and China that they provide significant support to Iran, one can assume that such support does not exist. We heard, oh yes, America was shocked, the Russians were shocked that Russia could pass on its intelligence to Iran. No, what a horror. That's all we saw. The Israelis said they sank ships here yesterday that were carrying Russian weapons to Iran. Russia denies that there were any weapons on these ships or that they were even Russian ships. But other than that, we don't hear about Russian weapons, about them being supplied. So what's the point of an alliance or a cooperation agreement? What's the point of Iran's membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or BRICS? I would say at this point, nothing. I don't want to be too harsh. I'm here because all of us, including the Russians and the Chinese, have learned, and of course Mr. Trump and his close associates know this, that Iran is quite capable of looking after its own interests. I also know more than anyone, not counting the 4,000-kilometer-long two-stage missile that was fired at Jerry Garcia, but only within the limits of short and medium-range missiles. They demonstrated the ability to maintain combat readiness. Prioritize your firing. Choose your firing time. Shoot at anything that comes from the command and control system, which was supposedly completely destroyed by American and Israeli attacks. So the Iranians held up very well. And of course, their backup is the Strait of Hormuz and their ability to inflict economic damage on the Middle East and everyone that the Middle East supplies. Primarily the Far East and to a lesser extent Europe. It was unforeseen that their organization could survive the kind of dramatic, horrific attacks that they did. But they did. And so you have to go back and ask the first question. Perhaps the Iranians were absolutely right, without entering into military defensive alliances with Russia or China and keeping their options open. I might not do this. I'll just mention it in passing. But the ability of the human to survive all of this was staggering. Their ability to maintain pressure on the globe and destroy almost all hydrocarbon production in the Middle East at will was staggering, which makes their power over the Strait of Hormuz practically irrelevant. If there is no production, then there's nothing for tankers to transport through the Strait of Hormuz. So no matter how you look at it, they're in an advantageous position. This was unexpected. Of course, the Russians did it. Officially, Russia never expected Iran to be able to mount a more effective asymmetric defense than the US with its direct aggression. Europe has been subjected to numerous attacks. Given that we see all the rules essentially thrown out, that they are not being respected, and that the US is so open about it, especially Peter Dixit, and now all this rhetoric about how we're supposedly adhering to international law and the rules of engagement, it's, political correctness. We'll do whatever it takes, essentially ignoring international law. How does this affect military calculations? calculations of the Russians and the Chinese because it seems is determined to defeat its adversaries. Many are again saying that the destruction of Iran will also be aimed at weakening China. How does this affect military cooperation? What is the potential? Well, is there any talk right now of deepening military cooperation between Russia, China, North Korea, and other countries? Okay, let's go back to the very beginning. As I mentioned in recent interviews in my articles, I wrote that the US and Israeli attack on Iran shook the Russian foreign ministry to its core. They were so shocked that they began to realize that the method the Putin's government used in a war of attrition. Not consistent with current security realities. They began to speak openly about it. In one of Solovyev's broadcasts, this was done in a shocking manner. They essentially condemned Putin in everything but his name. The next day, Salakov retracted his words and began talking about our wonderful commander-in-chief, who works tirelessly at 3 a.m. to ensure our well-being. But there were others who continued to criticize what was happening. Alexander Dugin, the core philosopher, as he was known in Putin's Kremlin, criticized the leadership of the military operation at least as harshly as Salakos, Salak. And of course, Dugin is untouchable after the brutal murder of his daughter. He's been made a hero, and no one dare say a word about him. And now, on his publicly accessible website, he condemned the slowness of the operation. So, a change in thinking is taking place. The question is where and when this pressure will be exerted on the president and what will happen. Regarding your question, it was discussed again on the same program, on the same talk show. Mr. Solovyov, after this shocking outburst and subsequent retraction, disappeared from the screens for a week. And I thought, my God, it looks like press freedom has just died. No, I was mistaken. He disappeared from the screens because he went with a parliamentary delegation from the Duma to visit his colleagues in Beijing. This was planned in advance and very opportunely. And one of the members of this delegation, the chairman of Duma committee who appeared again on the Soloviev program, explained that they wanted to discuss with the Chinese precisely the question you posed. The should not trilateral defense alliance between Russia, China, and North Korea be created now? And of course the question arises, how can one compare North Korea's military might with the might of the two superpowers, Russia and China, Huto? And of course, the truly interesting fact is that North Korea not only talks but also acts. There's reason to believe they're supplying Iran with munitions. Specifically, we're talking about underwater drones and missiles capable of destroying aircraft carriers. These weapons are supplied by North Korea. If you think about it, why aren't they supplying Iran with nuclear warheads? Maybe they are supplying them. We just don't know about it. But the point is, the North Koreans don't talk, they act. China and Russia just talk. This is evident from yesterday's or today's speeches. Lavrov comments on the latest events in the Middle East and simply whining. Oh, just look at what's happening. Yeah, excuse me, but they're the second most powerful country in the world by military power. I can only say, oh my God, this is so sad. This is a pathetic, verbal response to America's actions in the Middle East. Not to mention what America is doing in the Middle East, as Dmitriev would say, addressing anyone who gives him a microphone. Oh my God, this will really undermine the global economy. Brilliant observation, which none of us would have thought of without his help, of course. Russia is holding back and keeping quiet. And let me explain why. I don't want to criticize anyone. I just want to analyze the situation. As far as I understand, the reason is very simple. Russia has placed a bet on maintaining relations with everyone. When the situation is as critical as it is now, when it can easily escalate into a thorough war and not just to a recession, but to a global depression. You shouldn't try to negotiate with everyone and extend a hand of friendship to everyone. You need to do something and take a certain position. Russia is not doing this. On the contrary. But I heard on the Vesti program with Nadir Kiselyov on Sunday evening that Masalovev read like a prompter. He was clearly embarrassed by what he was reading, but these were the words of the Kremlin. He spoke about how sad it is that this conflict is that makes the Ramayrs the Persian Gulf countries. Well, that's because Mr. Putin wants to shake everyone's hands and show that Russia is acting as a mediator, because it is negotiating with all parties. I don't think this is an adequate response to the current difficult situation. Russia is shedding crocodile tears over the damage being inflicted on its competitors in the Persian Gulf countries or its competitors in the sphere of hydrocarbon supplies. This is unworthy. This is becoming obvious. Many other observers have already spoken out on this matter. I haven't commented on this topic, but now I have no other choice. Putin is leaning toward Israel's side. This is obvious. And his excuses don't stand up to any criticism. The excuse was, well, there are 2 million Russian speakers in Israel. They have our passports, and we don't see that this is harming them in any way. Well, friends, they are not our friends. Residents of Israel, holders of Israeli passports, dual citizens and Russian passports are also not friends of Moscow. And anyone who claims otherwise simply does not take their words seriously, including the Russian president. They are enemies. And Mr. Chubais was an enemy. And Nain Yeltsin is an enemy. And the Russian president covers for all of them. I will not continue. He has every opportunity to change course, and I hope that he will do so. But for now, Russia's status as a great power does not help in resolving the global crisis in the Middle East. I was thinking, you mentioned the Persian Gulf countries are, of course, competitors of Russia, especially the energy markets. But how do you assess other possible benefits for Russia? The media often write that Russia is the main winner in this war. To some extent, this is justified because energy prices are rising. Many of its competitors in the energy sector are leaving the market. The US had to partially lift sanctions against Russia. If this solidarity on the issue of sanctions, it will collapse, it will be difficult to rebuild. Weapons that would otherwise be used to kill Russians are being diverted elsewhere. But I think that the situation, including in China, will be more specifically affected by the weakening of alliances in the Middle East. We see that some Gulf countries are beginning to consider the wisdom of hosting American military bases in East Asia, for example, in South Korea. Some must be wondering how reliable these security guarantees are when the US is withdrawing all its Patriot missile defense systems and surface-to-air missile systems. And indeed, in Europe too, we are seeing an increasingly deep rift between the US and the EU. How beneficial do you think this is? Or do you think that what is happening is a weakening of the alliance system? After all, this is apparently a key component of hegemony. That is, if you can divide all regions of the world into obedient, independent allies and weakened adversaries. Well, I will answer this very important question. But first, I would like to ask you a counter question. Alliances, which we, in the alternative media, consider the key to the formation of a new global governance, multipolar, have collapsed. If you listen to Russian television, they are now talking about BRICS in a way that none of us expected. Judging by their discussions, by what has happened over the past 2 weeks, they have practically admitted that BRICS is worth nothing. 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 And I want to say this to all our colleagues. If the Russians say this, then why are they saying it? But before this, they saw that the United States put BRICS in a difficult position by imposing 50% sanctions on countries trading in Russian oil. And it worked. India stopped buying Russian oil, but that is in the past. Now they simply talk about BRICS. By the way, BRICS was never directed against America. This is an address on state television in Russian. BRICS was supposed to create an alternative system that would ultimately replace the weakened IMF and the World Trade Organization, all these structures that arose after World War II. And we would find ourselves in a situation, a new world order. Now, the Russians don't talk about it anymore. This explains why a year ago, I think, at the last BRICS meeting, or maybe 2 years ago when we all had a meeting in Kazan. It was in October, right? Well, when we realized that there would be no alternative to the existing exchanges, currency exchanges, no BRICS currency. And it seemed strange, but no one really focused on it. Now it's perfectly clear why. The Russians understood even then, but didn't say it out loud, that BRICS was practically useless. It became obvious. I would say that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization hasn't been very successful. Although at the last meeting it became clear that Russia and China intend to invest more in it since it is their main vector of movement forward to a new world governance. BRICS is losing its relevance. Therefore, when we say that Western organizations, be it NATO, the EU, or anything else, are falling apart, or that hidden cracks are appearing in them that have enormous significance for their further development, we mean what we thought were organizations uniting the East, but it turns out that they too are falling apart. Thus, the situation is becoming even more chaotic than we could have imagined. Yes, of course, in Europe, the collapse of the EU is only the beginning. I cannot imagine how Ursula von der Leyen can explain her statements that in the current situation of shortages and sharply rising prices, we will not import a single gram of Russian gas. And this is with high inflation. How can she explain this? All the leaders of Western Europe, although not known for their pragmatism, are faced with the politically dangerous problem of inflation. But how then can we understand the Europeans? After all, for them, it was a shock. They simply cut themselves off from Russian oil and gas supplies and were happy about it. And now, of course, they have also lost supplies from the Middle East. And we see that the US is now completely dependent on American LNG, and Trump can blackmail the EU, saying, "You will make this terrible trade deal that none of you wants, or you will no longer get access to our LNG on favorable terms." Who could have foreseen this? You cut yourself off from all other suppliers. And now the only supplier you're completely dependent on is using political leverage. So it's entirely predictable, but still, somewhat shocking. But what's happening in the EU, as you mentioned, the statement by the Dortleon Foundation, is fundamentally contrary to the national interests of member states. How do you think this will play out? I'd say there are exceptions, especially the Belgian Prime Minister. I think it's quite striking these days when everyone is forced to conform and can't afford to express dissent. They constantly use this expression, European solidarity, which is a pathetic excuse for abandoning common sense because, well, someone is obviously going down the wrong path, and some using slogans about European solidarity to imply that any dissent is something bad. But the Belgian Prime Minister proposed, such insignificant things as normalizing relations with Russia after the end of this war, for which he later criticized. So how do you think Europe will adapt to this war in Iran? Because it will, of course, also affect its position on the war in Ukraine. Well, it hasn't exactly changed completely, more like partially. If you look at Trump's odious behavior and odious statements, they are so contrary to European values that one wonders how long will this hypocrisy continue? Well, as if this man and this country are Europe's closest allies. It is so contrary to all the ideals that sooner or later it must stop. The question is, when and who will lead by example? Now, back to Bavaria. I'm very glad you mentioned him. I have my own opinion on this matter. I think he is running for the post of President of the European Commission. He speaks to journalists every day. His party posts his speeches and Q&A sessions on YouTube. He shows up to meet with European heads of a government like he did a week ago and walks by to 200 journalists with microphones. He stops here, stops there, and then in the fourth row, he's campaigning to get this job. I don't take his conformist statements seriously. I think he's simply playing the same game as Fico and Orban, but a much more cunning one. He doesn't want to anger people, doesn't want to expose himself, and tries not to say anything that would give his enemies a reason to strike and remove him from the path he wants to take. That's why he says he supports Ukraine, 100%. That's why he talks about his parents and how they took in Ukrainian refugees. That's why he says, yes, we will have normal relations with Russia only after signing a peace treaty that serves both us in Europe and Ukraine. As far as I understand, this is all empty words, because it's just defensive rhetoric, and he himself is doing what he thinks is right. After all, he did say that relations with Russia need to be normalized, and he actually explained, that if you have a peace treaty, And a PCDA means that you've resolved all the outstanding issues. And after that, you normalize relations. As he said, we did that after World War II, and we started to trade normally and all that. This is in direct contrast to what we hear from all the Russia haters in the EU. They want the PDA just a truce that will pave the way for a second or third rope when they try to push Russia out of Europe or make sure it doesn't even belong in Europe. So he's going down a completely different path, and I'm sure he's campaigning to lead the EU. No, that's a good idea. Well, again, this fits into this general European narrative. It seems they don't even want the war to end. They just want a ceasefire, and no one wants to find a way to restore relations with Russia. As you rightly noted, their rhetoric repeatedly echoes the idea that when this is over, we will be able to find another way to compete with the Russians or fight them on more favorable terms. In fact, even the war in Ukraine cannot be considered over. They even openly say that they need a break to catch their breath, regroup, and recover. But the war is not over. Therefore, I don't see in the reasoning a willingness to step back and discuss basic things. For example, what can really guarantee peace? What kind of stable and prosperous Europe do we envision in the future? One in which the largest country in Europe, in terms of population and military power, is constantly contained, and attempts are made to isolate it, one that is, so to speak, cut off from the rest of the continent. Will this guarantee stability? Will Western dominance be so strong that Russia will have to adapt to all? Will everyone be able to sit down at the negotiating table? Nobody's talking about that. All I hear is politics being used to cheap slogans about our values and Russian aggression. After all, despite all their faint concern for Ukraine, if they really wanted to save it, they would have removed it from this geopolitical game first. It's impossible to seriously convince anyone that this has helped Ukraine in any way. But still, in terms of ending the war, how the war in Iran has affected the possibilities for diplomacy. I would think the Russians aren't very happy with the deceptive diplomacy with Iran. That is, first with the VMPO, and then these dual surprise attacks when the negotiations were going well. How does this affect? I mean, they're talking about Alaska now in Moscow. What are they talking about in China? Because Xi Jinping was supposed to meet with Trump next month, but that meeting was postponed. Well, I've criticized the way this Vladimir Putin is managing the war. And even more harshly, I must criticize the position of the Chinese, who look like absolute weaklings. Their position on Iran is completely incomprehensible, given, as I said, their sponsorship of Iran in these two key international organizations where China and Russia are leaders. I mean, both BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's simply incomprehensible that they have done nothing significant to help Iran. None. And Mitt was so cautious in his statements about Iran. But this is too much for the Chinese. I don't know where this will lead. But it is absolutely clear that Europe will soon change. It is absolutely clear that the position of a few people is unsustainable. And this will require significant changes in leadership across the continent. But a good start would be to restore order here in Brussels and in the European institutions. I don't see how, as I said, the lady can survive what she has created with her own hands. Then that would be a good start to clean a clean house. But much still needs to be changed. We'll see if Mr. Orban survives the vote in a couple of weeks or a month. After all, he played an important role in standing up to the Brussels bureaucracy. Forgive me, I seem to have strayed. Could you rephrase the question? Possible avenues for diplomacy. The Russians saw Alaska as an option for advancement, and the Chinese, I think, hoped that this meeting, scheduled for next month, would help improve relations. For them, this is, of course, an opportunity to pause the economic war against China while the United States is in a difficult position. But in the current situation, President Putin, of course, finds himself in a very awkward position. A little over a month ago, there was a public rift between his position and that of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The opposition within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs began with Sergei Rogov declaring that the initiative emanating from Anchorage had fizzled out. But there was no longer room for diplomacy. This issue will be decided on the battlefield. He was immediately reprimanded, but 2 or 3 weeks later, his boss Sergei Lavrov said the same thing. All this time, Peskov, speaking on behalf of Putin, has been saying the opposite. They appointed Dmitriev, made him a very important figure. And now, let me not beat around the bush. As far as I understand, Dmitriev is an American agent. He is one of those liberals whom Putin has always coaxed into his position using the traditional method of power. You take a step to the right, then a step to the left, then right again. That's how Gorbachev held on to power until he fell. And I think the current head of state is playing the same game, which could lead to the same result. Sooner or later, a certain position will have to be taken. You can't constantly waver. President Putin has invested too much of his political capital in these negotiations. And if you look at them, you'd have to be crazy to believe that anything can be achieved with Donald Trump for all the reasons you just mentioned. No one is saying it outright, but it's perfectly clear that this war will end on the battlefield. And Trump's role in this is negligible. So serious rift is emerging in Russia, and it's unclear when and whether the president will be able to adapt to the new conditions. He hasn't yet. For now, they're quite happy that Trump has backed down and isn't insisting on new negotiations with Witkoff. But Putin will also have to decide whether to continue this farce. At the same time, we know perfectly well that what Mr. Zelensky said yesterday about the Russians right now preparing or already launching a large-scale summer offensive. That's true. The only thing that was untrue in Mr. Zelensky's statement was that the Russians are suffering heavy losses, 1,000 people a day. As we know, as I've seen over the past 4 years, every time Ukrainians talk about the Russian army losses, they project their own losses onto the Russians. It's entirely believable that the Ukrainians are losing 1,000 people a day, but it's not believable that the Russians are suffering the same losses. Nevertheless, the Russians certainly have losses. But what was insignificant, in Zelensky's words, which otherwise don't reflect what Russian state television is telling its audience, was that he talked about the use of tanks and heavy equipment which are being reintroduced into combat. This is partly due to the season, because now that the edge trees are leafing out, they have more cover. Spring is in full swing. But I don't think that's the only reason. I think the Russians are simply much more confident in their ability to deter Ukrainian drones or somehow counter them. And they are amassing heavy equipment. Something they haven't done for almost a year. So the GM is preparing for a large-scale offensive on Kramatorsk, Slavinsk, which are currently just 18 kilometers from Russian positions within artillery range. After which they will be able to seize everything they need in one fell swoop. Like you and me, we are astonished that after 4 years of war in the fear of a war that has lasted almost as long as World War II, Russia has captured only 5% of Donetsk Oblast's territory in the last few months, or 8%. The share of territory under Russian control has grown from 17% to 25%, from 25% of the territory, and the Ukrainian held territory has grown to 18%. Donetsk Oblast's territory. Until now, their actions have been understandably extremely cautious. Very soon, we will see whether they can break through and reach the interior in a matter of weeks, not years. So all this is ahead. And the last question, we see that as global developments unfold, the Ukrainian counteroffensive has achieved some success, particularly in the south near Zaporizhzhia. How do you explain this? Given that in recent weeks Ukraine has lost a significant portion of its funding and weapon supplies, given that the front line stretches for 1,200 kilometers. And if they found a weak spot, and they clearly have, they'll exploit it, But I wouldn't say that isolated successes and unexpected maneuvers will change the overall picture, namely the advance of Russian troops, as I've already said, toward the last two major, medium-level strongholds and elevations, Novivyanska and Kramatorsk. Surprisingly, Ukrainian success will only be for those of us who, week after week, talk about how the Russians have broken through Ukraine's defenses, that their excessive recruitment efforts have been completely unsuccessful, and so on. As you know, there are many among our colleagues and on EU platforms who publish this daily. The most dire, sensational predictions that the war will end with Russian victory and Ukraine's capitulation seem like a piece of cake. It was never a piece of cake. The Ukrainians, despite everything, fought with great tenacity. Russian state television says this, but almost none of Marcos colleagues said, Dalia Bikazh say it. And I'm ashamed of them, because morale in Ukraine remains strong. But there is the problem you mentioned. They have very little equipment, and, of course, their army has been significantly depleted. This is an undeniable fact, and that's precisely why they said they can concentrate their forces in one or two places. But along the entire 2-kilometer front line, Russia has the strategic advantage. Russia certainly has a strategic advantage. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I appreciate it. And now I think that, it seems that, this is increasingly reminiscent of, a world war where one conflict influences another. I don't think we've reached that point yet. But given the scale and global implications and how these wars and conflicts, and from the war in Ukraine to the Iran-US standoff, are impacting the US-China rivalry, it's safe to say that it's all heading that way toward globalization. Are there any thoughts you'd like to share with us, Peru, before we wrap up? No, I think I completely agree with what you're saying. This is truly a global problem. These two conflicts are closely linked. And of course, the depletion of US air defense assets during the Israeli-Iranian war is a serious blow to Ukraine. So to put it very simply, in terms of equipment availability, these two conflicts are directly linked, and that's not beneficial for Ukraine.